He promised her a new life out west. Now he was gone, buried under a pile of prairie stones. And as the wind whipped around her, Elara knew two terrible truths. She was completely alone, and the tiny life growing inside her was depending on her to be brave. The wagon had stopped moving. For the first time in weeks, the only sound was the low, lonely moan of the wind across the endless grass. It was a huge, empty sound that filled the whole world. Elara stood beside the wooden wheel, her hand resting on her round belly. She looked at the small pile of stones she had built with her own bleeding hands. Under those stones lay her husband, Samuel. His fever had come on fast and fierce, and in 2 days, he was gone. Her heart felt as empty and flat as the land around her. They had been so full of hope. Samuel had talked of rich soil and a big sky. He promised her a home of their own, a place to raise their child. He had been so brave, so sure of their future. Now that future was a grave on the side of a trail they never finished. Elara was stranded. They had pushed ahead of their wagon train after a delay, meaning to meet them further along. Now, she had no idea if anyone else would ever come this way again. All she had was the claim shack. It was a sad little thing. Just one room made of sod bricks cut from the earth. The roof was grass and dirt. It smelled like damp soil and loneliness. It was not the home Samuel had described in his excited stories, but it was the only shelter she had. Inside were a few supplies, a bedroll, and the crushing silence of being by herself. For days, she moved like a ghost. She ate a little bit of the hard bread and dried meat. She drank from a nearby creek. She spoke to the baby inside her, because her own voice was the only friendly sound she knew. She cried until she had no tears left. The prairie was so big, and she was so small. At night, the darkness was total, a thick blackness that felt heavy. The stars were cold and bright, and millions of miles away. She felt God must be that far away, too. One afternoon, a week after she buried Samuel, a man on a horse appeared. Elara's heart jumped with a wild hope. Was it help? Had the wagon train found her? But as he got closer, she saw he was not a farmer. He wore a clean shirt and carried a leather bag. He tipped his hat to her. He was not unkind, but his eyes were all business. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. "I'm Mr. Evans. I'm with the land office." Elara's hope turned into a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She knew what this was about. To keep the land, you had to prove you were working it. You had to build a home and farm the soil. A single woman could not hold a claim. The law did not allow it. "My husband," she started, but her voice was a dry whisper. He passed on. "Just last week." Mr. Evans took off his hat. He looked truly sorry. "I am mighty sorry to hear that, ma'am. That is a terrible thing." He looked around at the empty land. "But I have to do my job. The rules are the rules. A family has to be working this land. Without a man here, I can't mark this claim as valid." Terror washed over Elara. "What does that mean?" she asked, though she already knew. "It means the territory will take this land back," he said gently. "You have 30 days to pack up and, well, to find somewhere else to go." "Where would I go?" The question came out as a desperate plea. "There is nowhere else." Mr. Evans shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. He was not a bad man, but he had a list of claims to check. "There's a family 10 miles east who might take you in as help. Or perhaps you could go back east to your family?" Elara had no family back east. That was why they had come west. This land, this sad little sod house, was all she had. It was all she could give her child, and now it was being taken from her. "I will make it work," she said, her voice shaking. "I can farm it myself. I am strong." The man shook his head. "I believe you, ma'am, but the law doesn't. It requires a man's name on the paper. A family unit. I'm real sorry. He wrote something in his book. I'll be back in 1 month's time. I hope you find a solution by then. God be with you." He turned his horse and rode away. Elara watched him until he was just a speck on the huge, golden prairie. Then she sank to her knees in the grass. The wind blew, but she didn't feel it. The sun shone, but she felt cold. She had lost her husband. Now she would lose her home. She had 30 days. And then she and her baby would have nothing at all. She did not know how long she sat there. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of fire, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps. She looked up, expecting to see Mr. Evans returned. Instead, she saw an older man with a kind face and gentle eyes. He wore simple clothes and a collar that marked him as a preacher. "Hello there," he said, his voice as calm as a quiet river. "I'm Pastor Miller from a small town down the valley. I was visiting a family nearby, and I heard there was a new settler out here who might be in need of a friend." Elara just looked at him. She had no words left. The pastor saw the fresh pile of stones. He saw the despair on her face. He did not need to ask what had happened. His own face filled with a deep sadness. "Oh, my dear child," he whispered. He did not try to give her a lecture or a Bible verse. He simply sat down in the grass beside her, a quiet presence in the overwhelming silence. After a long while, he spoke. "It is a hard thing to be alone in a new place." He looked out at the land. "This country can be very lonely." Elara nodded, a single tear finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. The pastor was quiet for another moment, thinking. "It is a strange thing," he said slowly, almost to himself, "how the Lord sometimes puts two problems next to each other, and sometimes the answer to one is the answer to the other." Elara looked at him, not understanding. He turned to her, his eyes full of a new, careful thought. "I know of another soul," he said. "A good man. A farmer. He lost his family to sickness last winter. His wife and little boy. The loneliness is eating him alive. He is about to lose his farm too. Not to the law, but to his own broken heart. He has stopped caring for it." The pastor looked from Elara's face to the grave of her husband. Two problems. One of the law, one of the heart, both needing a family to survive. He took a slow breath. "I cannot make a suggestion that is not unusual, but perhaps an arrangement could be made, a practical arrangement, for both your sakes." Elara waited, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She did not know what he was going to say, but for the first time since Mr. Evans had ridden away, she felt a tiny, tiny flicker of something that was not complete hopelessness. It was the smallest spark of chance. The spark of chance the pastor had offered felt small and fragile in Elara's heart. For 2 days, she turned his words over in her mind. A practical arrangement. It sounded so cold, like a business deal. But what other choice did she have? The thought of her baby being born with no roof, no food, no safety, was worse than any cold business deal. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Gideon stood in his barn. He was sharpening a scythe. The scrape of the metal on the stone, the only sound. His movements were slow and heavy, like each one took great effort. His farm was quiet, too quiet. The chickens scratched in the yard, and his 2 cows chewed their cud. But the life had gone out of the place. His cabin was neat and clean, but it felt like a museum of a life that was over. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small wooden doll. It had been his daughter's. Next to it was a hair comb that had belonged to his wife, Clara. He kept them there, perfect and untouched, like if he moved them, he would forget their faces. The silence in the cabin was a presence itself, a heavy blanket of sadness. When Pastor Miller rode into his yard, Gideon did not smile. He just gave a slow nod and kept on sharpening his tool. "Gideon," the pastor said, tying his horse to the post, "the fields look good." "They look empty," Gideon replied, not looking up. The pastor leaned against the barn door. "I met a young woman the other day, out on the new claim to the west. Elara. Her husband died on the journey. She buried him herself." Gideon's hand stilled for a moment. A flicker of pain crossed his face. He knew that kind of loss. It was a club no one wanted to belong to. "That's a hard thing," he said softly. "It is," Pastor Miller agreed. "The land agent has given her 30 days. If she can't prove her family is working the land, she loses it all. She's with child Gideon." Now Gideon looked up, his eyes meeting the pastor's. He saw the deep worry there. He thought of Clara, of how scared she had been when she was expecting. His heart, which had felt like a stone for so long, gave a painful squeeze. "The law is not kind to women alone," Gideon said, his voice rough. "No, it is not," the pastor said. He took a step closer. "And I look at you, my friend. I see a good man being eaten alive by loneliness. You are here, but you are not living. Your farm needs a woman's touch. Your heart needs a reason to beat again." Gideon shook his head, a sharp, angry movement. "Clara was my wife. This was her home. Bringing another woman here, it would be a betrayal. It would be like saying she can be replaced." The very idea felt like a sin. "I am not talking about replacement," the pastor said gently. "I am talking about survival. For both of you. This would not be a real marriage. Not in the way you had with Clara. It would be an agreement. A partnership. She needs a name to save her land and her child. You need a reason to come in from the fields at night. You need to remember what it is to care for someone." Gideon looked away, toward the cabin. He saw the doll on the mantel in his mind's eye. He thought of the empty chair at his table, the empty half of his bed. The silence was so loud it was deafening. It would be a name only. The pastor pressed. "A document. Rules. You would have help with the farm. She would have safety. It is a practical solution to two impossible problems." Gideon was silent for a long time. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree by the barn. He thought of the young woman, alone and pregnant, facing a future with nothing. He knew that terror. He had felt it watching his family slip away, helpless to stop it. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath. It was not a sigh of agreement, but of surrender. Surrender to a situation that offered no good choices, only a less terrible one. "All right," he whispered, the words tasting like dust. "I will meet her." The meeting was held in the neutral space of Pastor Miller's small church. Elara wore her best dress, which was still faded and travel-worn. Gideon wore a clean shirt, his hands scrubbed raw from washing. They sat on hard wooden benches, not looking at each other. It was painfully awkward. The pastor did most of the talking. "It seems the best path forward is one of mutual help," he said. "Gideon has a good, sturdy cabin. It has a loft that can be private quarters for you, Elara. You would cook and keep house. Gideon would work the land and provide. Your child would have a roof and a name." Elara's eyes flickered to Gideon. He was a big man, broad-shouldered from farm work. His face was kind but etched with deep lines of grief. He did not look cruel. He looked tired. So very tired. "And the marriage?" Elara asked, her voice small. "On paper only," Gideon said, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep and quiet, like far-off thunder. "A business arrangement. For 1 year. Then we can decide what to do next." He could not bring himself to look at her directly. He saw her youth, her swollen belly, and it was a reminder of everything he had lost. Elara nodded. It was more than she had dared hope for. Safety, shelter, a name for her baby. "I would be grateful for the help," she said softly. "I will have a paper drawn up," Pastor Miller said, relieved. "It will say that this is a marriage of convenience, that you will share a home and work together, but that, well, that your lives are your own." A few days later, it was done. They stood before the pastor and said the words, "I do." They felt like the biggest lies Elara had ever told. Gideon signed his name with a firm hand, but his jaw was tight. He felt like he was betraying Clara's memory with every stroke of the pen. Elara gathered her few things from the sod shack. She said a silent goodbye to the grave on the prairie. Then she climbed into Gideon's wagon for the slow ride to her new life. Gideon's cabin was indeed sturdy. It was made of proper logs, with a real glass window and a stone fireplace. It was a good house. But as Elara stepped inside, she felt a sadness immediately. It was so clean and so empty. She saw the doll on the mantel and understood. This was not just a house. It was a shrine. Gideon carried her trunk to the foot of the ladder that led to the loft. "This will be your space," he said, his voice formal. "I will sleep by the fire." Elara just nodded. The loft was small and dark, but it was private. It was hers. The first week was a minefield of quiet politeness. They moved around each other like two shy ghosts. Gideon would come in from the fields and eat the food she made without a word, then go back outside. Elara tried to clean, but she was afraid to touch anything, especially the doll and the comb. One afternoon, she saw him watching her struggle to split kindling for the fire. Her arms were not strong enough, and the axe was too heavy. She was getting nowhere. She finally gave up, frustrated and near tears. She went inside to start supper. Later, when she went back out for wood, she found the axe was gone. In its place was a smaller, lighter hatchet, its blade newly sharpened. It was leaning against the woodpile. Gideon was nowhere to be seen. It was a small act, but it was the first kind thing anyone had done for her in a long time. It felt like a message. I see you. I will help. That night, she made a stew with the vegetables from his garden. She used the last of her dried herbs to make it taste good. When Gideon came in, he saw the pot simmering. He sat down and ate 2 full bowls. It was the first real meal he had eaten since his wife died. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't have to. The empty bowl said it for him. They were 2 lost people, orbiting each other in a quiet dance of grief and need. They were strangers under one roof, bound by a piece of paper. But that week, the first tiny, fragile thread of connection was spun between them. It was as thin as a spider's web, but it was there. The days began to find a rhythm, like a slow, steady heartbeat. Elara would wake in her loft to the sound of Gideon building the fire below. She would come down and make oatmeal or pancakes if they had flour. Gideon would eat quickly, his eyes on the door, eager to get out to the fields. The work of a farm never waited. Elara kept the cabin clean, but she moved around the memories and sighed it like they were made of glass. She dusted around the doll and the comb. She never moved them. It felt like stepping on someone's grave. One sunny morning, her eyes fell on a patch of earth near the side of the cabin. It was a rectangle of rich, dark soil, but it was choked with weeds and looked sad and forgotten. Something about it called to her. She found Gideon mending a harness by the barn. "Gideon," she asked, her voice still shy. "That patch by the cabin, what was it?" He looked up, his eyes following her pointing finger. A shadow passed over his face, so quick she almost missed it. He looked down at the leather in his hands. "That was Clara's garden," he said, his voice low. "She loved it. Grew flowers. Some vegetables, too." He fell silent, and Elara knew he was lost in a memory. She took a small breath for courage. "It seems a shame for good soil to go to waste," she said carefully. "Would it be all right if I cleared it? Maybe planted some things? It would be good to have fresh greens closer to the house." Gideon was very still. For a terrible moment, Elara thought she had made a huge mistake. She had trespassed on a sacred memory. She was about to take it back when he finally spoke. "I suppose it would be a shame," he said quietly, still not looking at her. "The tools are in the shed. There should be seed packets in a tin on the shelf." It was not a joyful yes. It was a permission. It was him allowing the world to move forward just a little bit. That became her project. She spent hours on her knees, pulling weeds, feeling the sun on her back. It was hard work, especially with her growing belly, but it felt good. It felt like she was doing something positive, making something grow instead of just trying to survive. One evening, after a quiet supper, she was sitting in her chair mending a sock. Gideon was sitting in his, staring into the fire. The baby began to kick, hard and strong. It was a feeling that still surprised her. She gasped a little and put a hand on her stomach. Gideon looked over, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right?" Elara nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Yes, it's just the baby. It's very active tonight." She saw the strange look on his face, a mix of curiosity and pain. Without really thinking, she asked, Would you like to feel?" Gideon's eyes went wide. He looked startled, like a rabbit caught in a lantern's glow. He stared at her hand on her stomach, then looked away quickly, back at the fire. His jaw was tight. "No," he said, the word coming out rough and too fast. "No, thank you." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping on the wooden floor. "I will check on the animals," he muttered, and he was out the door into the night. Elara's heart sank. She had pushed too far. She had forgotten that the baby was a reminder of his own loss. She sat alone in the quiet cabin, listening to the distant sound of the cows in the barn, and felt the wall between them grow thick again. But later that night, as she lay in her loft, she heard the soft sound of wood scraping against wood from downstairs. She peeked through a crack in the floorboards. Gideon was sitting by the embers of the fire, a piece of sandpaper in one hand and a curved piece of wood in the other. He was smoothing it, his movements slow and careful. She didn't know what he was making, but the sight of him creating something, after so long, filled her with a strange sense of hope. A week later, the garden was finally clear. Elara had planted rows of seeds, carrots, beans, and a few flower seeds she found in the tin. She felt a little pride every time she looked at it. She had made her mark on this place, however small. One evening after supper, Gideon cleared his throat. It was a loud sound in the quiet cabin. He looked nervous. "I have something for you," he said. He went to the corner of the room and brought out the object he had been working on at night. It was a cradle. It was beautifully made from smooth, honey-colored wood. He had carved little swirls on the headboard and sanded every edge until it was silky to the touch. It rocked on curved runners he had fashioned himself. "For the baby," he said, his voice gruff. He held it out to her, not quite meeting her eyes. Elara was speechless. She reached out and touched the wood. It was perfect. It was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given her. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sadness. "Gideon," she whispered, "you made this. It's wonderful. Thank you." Her voice broke on the last word. He nodded, looking down at his boots. The wood was from the old oak that fell last winter. It seemed a good use for it. He was trying to make it sound like a simple, practical thing, but they both knew it was so much more. It was an apology for his sharpness. It was an acceptance of the baby. It was a gift. The next day, they had to go into town for supplies they could not make themselves: flour, salt, nails. The wagon ride was quiet, but not as tense as before. The cradle sat between them and the wagon bed, a silent promise of the future. Town was a bustling little place, with a general store and a blacksmith. People nodded to Gideon, but they stared at Elara with open curiosity. She held her head high, but she felt her face grow warm. In the general store, the owner, a friendly man with a big mustache, looked from Gideon to Elara. "Well, hello there, Gideon. Who's this?" Gideon hesitated for only a second. He looked at Elara, then back at the storekeeper. "This is my wife, Elara," he said. The words were clear and firm. The storekeeper's face broke into a wide smile. "Well, congratulations. It's fine to see you doing so well, Gideon. And ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Elara, "what can we get for you folks today?" As Gideon listed their supplies, an older woman came up to Elara. She looked her up and down, her eyes lingering on Elara's rounded stomach. "So you're the new Mrs. Carter," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was probing. "We were all so fond of Clara. Such a tragedy. It's good to see Gideon moving on." Elara felt a flush of heat. She didn't know what to say. She felt like an imposter, but before she could speak, Gideon finished his order and turned around. He must have heard. He stepped closer to Elara, and for the first time, he placed a hand on the small of her back. It was a light touch, but it felt solid and protective. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said to the woman, his voice polite but final. "We must be going. Lots to do on the farm." He guided Elara gently toward the counter, his hand staying on her back until they were out of the woman's sight. On the wagon ride home, the silence was comfortable. The wall between them felt thinner. That night, as they ate the stew Elara had made, she gathered her courage. "Gideon," she asked softly, "do you ever go to church on Sundays?" The spoon in his hand stilled. He looked into his bowl, his face closing up. "No," he said. His voice was flat. "God took my family from me. I have nothing to say to him, and I don't want to hear anything he has to say to me." The anger in his voice was like a cold wind. Elara nodded, her heart aching for his pain. She did not argue. She did not try to tell him God had a plan. She just said, "I understand." Later, before she climbed the ladder to her loft, she did something she hadn't done since arriving. She bowed her head over her empty plate, folded her hands, and said a silent prayer of thanks for the food, for the safety, and for the kind, hurting man who shared his home with her. She didn't know if he was watching, but she hoped in some small way he might see that her faith was not about having easy answers. It was about finding light in the darkness, just like he had when he made the cradle. It was about being thankful for the small gifts, even when the big ones had been taken away. The summer sun was high and hot, baking the earth around the cabin. Elara's garden was a vibrant patch of green, the bean plants starting to climb the sticks she had pushed into the soil. The simple act of watching things grow was a daily joy. One afternoon, the sound of an approaching wagon broke the peaceful silence. A woman Elara had never seen before was driving it. She was dressed in a stiff, city-style dress, and her eyes were sharp and curious as she took in the farm. Gideon was coming from the field for a drink of water. He stopped when he saw the woman, and a look of surprise and dread crossed his face. "Martha," he said. The woman tied up her horse and walked over, her gaze sweeping over Elara and her obvious pregnancy. "Gideon, I was passing through on my way to Sioux Falls, and thought I would pay my respects. It's been too long." Her smile was thin. "And who is this?" Gideon's shoulders stiffened. "Martha, this is my wife, Elara." "Elara, this is Martha." She was a cousin of Clara's. Martha's eyebrows shot up. "Your wife? Well, that is news." Her tone made it clear she thought it was suspicious news. How unexpected. Elara felt her face grow warm. She wiped her hands on her apron. "It is a pleasure to meet you," she said, trying to sound polite and steady. Martha barely acknowledged her. She turned back to Gideon. "I suppose life moves on, though it is a shock to see another woman in Clara's home, using Clara's things." Her eyes darted around the yard, looking for faults. The visit was a long and painful ordeal. Martha insisted on coming inside. She pointed out a crack in a window pane Gideon hadn't fixed. She remarked that the curtains looked faded. She stared at the doll and comb on the mantel, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I see you've kept their memories close," she said, her voice implying the opposite. Elara offered her tea, but Martha refused. She just kept asking pointed questions. "So how did you two meet? It must have been very quick." Her meaning was clear. She thought Elara had trapped him, or that he had dishonored Clara's memory by moving on too fast. Gideon's answers were short and gruff. He was growing angrier by the minute. Elara could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. She felt like an intruder, a criminal in her own home. Finally, Martha stood to leave. She stood in the doorway, looking at Gideon with a false sweetness. "I am glad you found companionship, Gideon. I'm sure Clara would have wanted you to be happy." Her eyes slid to Elara, stripping her of any worth. In her own way. That was the final straw. Gideon's hand, which had been resting on the doorframe, clenched into a fist. He stepped forward, his large frame blocking the doorway. His voice, when he spoke, was low and firm, filled with a protectiveness that stunned Elara. "Clara was a good and kind woman," Gideon said, looking Martha straight in the eye. "She would never have stood for someone being cruel to a guest in her home. Elara is not just my companionship. She is my wife. This is her home now, and we are building our future here, together. Thank you for stopping by." Martha's mouth fell open. She had no reply. She simply nodded, turned on her heel, and marched to her wagon, whipping the horse into a trot down the road. Silence descended again. Gideon stood in the doorway, watching her go, his shoulders still tense. Elara stood by the table, her heart pounding. He had defended her. He had called her his wife, not just to a friendly storekeeper, but to someone who questioned it. He turned around and looked at her. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a tired sadness. "I am sorry you had to endure that," he said. Elara shook her head. You were wonderful," she whispered. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his lips. It was the first one she had ever seen on his face. It changed him completely. She was always a difficult woman, he said. Then he let out a long breath, and the strange tension of the afternoon broke. They ended up working side by side in the garden later, weeding the rows. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable now. It was the silence of two people who had faced a storm together and found they made a good team. The air changed. It grew cooler at night, and the leaves on the oak tree began to hint at gold and red. Harvest time had arrived. The wheat in Gideon's field stood tall and ready, a sea of gold waving under the vast blue sky. There was no time for awkwardness now. The work was too urgent. They rose before the sun and worked until the light was gone. Gideon swung the scythe, cutting the tall stalks with a steady rhythm. Elara followed behind, gathering the wheat into bundles and tying them with twine. Her back ached, and her hands grew raw, but she did not complain. She saw the respect in Gideon's eyes when he looked at her hard work. They fell into a perfect rhythm. He would cut, she would gather. He would pitch the bundles onto the wagon. She would drive the horse to the next row. They were partners, their movements synced without a word needing to be spoken. They were too tired for pretense or fear. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange, Elara was trying to climb down from the loaded wagon. It was high, and her balance was off with her heavy belly. She slipped. Gideon's hand shot out instantly, catching her arm and steadying her. His grip was strong and sure. He helped her down, and for a moment, her feet safely on the ground, his hand did not let go. It held her elbow, warm and solid. Their eyes met. The air between them crackled with a new feeling, something alive and electric. It was more than just gratitude. It was a connection, strong and real. Elara's breath caught in her throat. Gideon's eyes were wide, as if he too felt the shocking jolt of it. He dropped his hand quickly, as if her skin had burned him. He took a step back, turning his face away. "We should get the animals in," he mumbled, his voice rough. "A storm is coming." He was right. The air had a strange, heavy feel to it. The sky to the north was a bruised, purplish black. They worked quickly to secure the tools and get the animals into the barn. The first drops of rain, cold and hard, began to fall as they ran for the cabin. By nightfall, the storm had exploded into a full-blown blizzard. It was too early for snow, but it came anyway, a furious, whirling madness of white. The wind howled around the cabin, shaking the walls. The world outside disappeared into a wall of swirling white. They were trapped. Elara woke in the deep, dark heart of the night. A pain, sharp and cramping, low in her belly, had pulled her from sleep. It was different from the baby's kicks. It was a tightening, a deep ache that came and then went away. Then it came again, stronger this time. She knew what it meant. The baby was coming. Now, in the middle of a blizzard that buried the world, there was no doctor, no midwife, no way to get help. They were completely, utterly alone. Another pain seized her, and she could not hold back a cry. Within seconds, Gideon's worried face appeared at the bottom of the loft ladder, lit by the lantern he held. "Elara, what is it? Are you hurt?" "It's the baby," she gasped, clutching her stomach as the pain faded. "The baby is coming." The color drained from Gideon's face. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, his eyes wide with pure terror. He looked from her to the window, where the snow was plastered against the glass. There was no escape, no help. This was his deepest fear. He had failed his first family. He had been helpless to save them. Now it was happening all over again. For a terrifying moment, Gideon was paralyzed. The howling wind sounded like the ghosts of his past, screaming that he would fail again. He saw the fear in Elara's eyes, and it mirrored his own. But then something in him shifted. This was not a sickness he couldn't fight. This was life, demanding to be let in. He could either stand by and watch, or he could help. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the fear in his eyes was replaced by a fierce determination. "All right," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We can do this." He helped her down from aloft and made a nest for her by the fire with every blanket and pillow they had. He stoked the fire until it roared, heating water, finding clean cloths. His movements were sure and steady, the same efficient way he fixed a broken plow or tended a sick calf. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort for Elara. The storm raged outside, but inside, the cabin became a small, warm world of its own. Gideon was there for every moment. He held her hand during the worst of the pains, his rough, calloused fingers gentle around hers. He mopped her brow with a cool cloth. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, telling her she was strong, that she was doing so well. In his heart, he was praying. He hadn't prayed in over a year. The words were rusty and felt strange in his mind, but they were there. Please, not again. Help me help her. When the time came, his farmer's hands, so used to bringing new life into the world with the animals, were gentle and sure. He followed Elara's lead, encouraging her, until finally, a tiny, crying sound filled the cabin. It was the most beautiful sound Gideon had ever heard. He caught the tiny, slippery baby, his hands trembling now not with fear, but with awe. He cleaned her little face and wrapped her in a soft, warm blanket. He looked at the perfect little person, with 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, and his heart, which had been a cold, hard stone for so long, cracked wide open. He carried the baby to Elara, who was exhausted but glowing. He placed the bundle in her arms. "A girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elara looked down at her daughter, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. She looked up at Gideon, seeing the tears in his own eyes. "Thank you," she breathed. "I couldn't have done it without you." He just shook his head, overwhelmed. He sat on the floor beside the bedroll, his back against the wall, watching as Elara held her baby. The storm was still blowing, but the worst was over. Inside, there was only peace. Holding the newborn, looking at her perfect, sleeping face, Gideon finally broke. The dam holding back all his grief burst. A sob tore from his throat, and he buried his face in his hands. The tears came then, hot and fast, for the wife and son he had lost, for the year of loneliness, for the terror of almost failing again. "I couldn't save them," he choked out, the words raw and painful. "Clara and my boy, the fever, there was nothing I could do. I felt so helpless. I thought it was my fault." Elara listened, her own heart breaking for him. She understood now. His silence wasn't coldness. It was a deep, terrible pain. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "It wasn't your fault, Gideon," she said softly. "You didn't fail them, and you didn't fail us. You were so brave tonight. You saved us." He looked up at her, his face wet with tears, and in that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled to dust. They were no longer a widow and a widower bound by a contract. They were two people who had just faced a great trial together and won. "What will you name her?" he asked, his voice rough from crying. Elara looked from his face to her daughter's. She knew the right name instantly. It was the only name that fit. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Gideon nodded, a real, true smile breaking through his tears. "Hope," he repeated. It was a perfect name. Life in the cabin was transformed. The crying of a baby, once a sound that would have brought Gideon terrible pain, now filled the house with a new kind of music. He was a natural father. He walked the floor with Hope when she was fussy, his big hands holding her tiny body with amazing gentleness. He hummed old tunes his mother had sung to him as he rocked her to sleep. The marriage of convenience had become a real family. They ate meals together. They talked about the farm, about the weather, about Hope. They laughed together when the baby made a funny face. The practical arrangement had grown a heart, and it was beating strongly. One afternoon, a familiar horse and rider appeared on the road. It was Mr. Evans, the land agent. Elara's heart jumped into her throat. She had almost forgotten about the contract, the reason all of this had started. Gideon came in from the field, wiping his brow. He saw the agent and then looked at Elara. He gave her a small, steady nod. "It will be all right." Mr. Evans tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Gideon, I've come for the final inspection." "Welcome," Gideon said, his voice calm. The agent looked around. He saw the well-kept yard, the fields that were harvested and tidy. He saw the washing on the line, the sturdy cabin. Then his eyes fell on Elara, who was holding a baby in her arms. "Well now," he said, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. "I see things have changed since my last visit. Congratulations." "This is our daughter, Hope," Elara said, her voice proud. "A fine name," the agent said. He looked from the baby to Gideon, who had come to stand beside Elara, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. It was not an act. It was the truth. The agent took out his book and made a check mark. "Well, the claim is clearly being worked by a family unit. Everything seems to be in order. The land is yours." He closed his book with a snap. "It's good to see a family thriving out here. It's hard country. You take care of each other." He tipped his hat again and rode away. They had done it. They had saved the land. The external goal they had agreed upon was complete. The contract was fulfilled. But instead of joy, a cold dread settled in Elara's stomach. The contract was over. The reason for her to stay was gone. Would Gideon still want them? Or had they just been a means to an end for him too? Now that he had his land secure, would he ask them to leave? She watched him that evening as he played with Hope, making her little fingers wave. He looked happy. But was it just happiness about the farm? She began to quietly pull her things together, her heart breaking. She would not make him ask. She would leave with her dignity and her gratitude intact. Gideon noticed her quiet sadness. He saw the way she looked at her trunk. He felt the same fear. The paper that had bound them was meaningless now. Did she only see him as a means of safety? Now that she had her claim, would she and the baby leave? The thought was like a physical pain in his chest. He could not lose them. He could not go back to that silent, empty cabin. The end date of the contract came and went. Neither of them mentioned it. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken words and a terrible, fearful silence. They were both waiting for the other to say something, both too afraid of the answer. The silence in the cabin became a heavy weight. Elara moved through her days with a quiet sorrow, folding her clothes and placing them in her trunk when Gideon was outside. Each item felt like a goodbye. She looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully in the cradle Gideon had made, and her heart ached. This was the only home her daughter had ever known. How could she leave it? But how could she stay if she was not truly wanted? One morning, she could bear it no longer. Gideon was heading out to the barn. She took a deep, shaky breath and stopped him at the door. "Gideon," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I want to thank you for everything, for the roof over our heads, for helping bring hope into the world, for being kind." He turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Elara, what is this?" "The contract is over," she said, forcing the words out. "The land agent approved the claim. You have your farm secure. You have done your duty. I will not burden you any longer. I will pack our things and go. You can have your life back." For a moment, Gideon just stared at her, stunned. Then, a look of pure panic crossed his face. "Go," he said, the words sounding strangled. "Go where? There's nowhere for you to go." "I will find a way," she said, though her eyes filled with tears. "I was a burden you were forced to carry. I understand. It was just a business arrangement." "No," the word burst from him, loud and firm. He stepped toward her, his eyes wide with a new understanding. He saw the trunk by the ladder. He saw her broken heart. And he finally saw the truth. She thought he didn't want her. "Elara, no," he said, his voice softening. He reached into the pocket of his worn work shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was their contract. He didn't unfold it. Instead, he looked her straight in the eye, his own eyes shining with tears. "This paper," he said, holding it up, "it saved your land. It saved my farm from my own loneliness. But it means nothing to me now. Nothing at all." He did something then that made her breath catch. He slowly, deliberately, tore the paper in half. Then he tore it again and again, letting the pieces fall to the floor like snow. "The only promise I want," he said, his voice raw with emotion, is the one from my heart. I don't want you to go. I want you to stay. Not because of a contract. Not out of duty. He took another step closer, until he was right in front of her. He gently took her hands in his. I love you, Elara. I love your strength. I love your kindness. I love the way you brought life back to this house and to my heart. I love our daughter. Please don't go. Please stay and be my wife. For real. Tears of joy streamed down Elara's face. The weight she had carried for weeks lifted and flew away. She looked up at this good, kind, strong man who had given her everything. I love you too, Gideon, she whispered. Not as a savior, but as a man. My man. He leaned down then, and their lips met in their first, real, loving kiss. It was a kiss that held all the promises of the future. A future built not on convenience, but on love. 1 year later, the family walked together through the late summer grass. Gideon carried Hope on his shoulders, her little hands clutching his hair. Elara carried a small bunch of flowers from the garden she had brought back to life. They stopped before 2 headstones side by side, one for Samuel, a kind man who had set her on this path, and one for Clara and Gideon's son, a family he would always love and remember. Elara knelt and placed the flowers by Clara's stone. Gideon lifted Hope down and held her in his arms. We remember them, Gideon said softly, his voice full of peace. And we honor them, Elara added, taking his free hand, by living and loving and building a future. They stood there together, a family united by choice and commitment, bound by a love that had healed the past. They had planted seeds of hope in the rocky soil of their grief, and now they were finally harvesting a love that would last a lifetime. Did you enjoy following Elara and Gideon's journey to find love and hope on the prairie? If this story touched your heart, please let us know by leaving a like. Subscribe for more heartfelt tales of love, faith, and new beginnings.